They say Detroit is a city of resilience, and for 29 years I'd considered myself a pretty good embodiment of that spirit. My name is Ryan Kelly, and I'd always believed in working hard, keeping my word and sticking by the people I cared about. I grew up here, the son of a mechanic and a schoolteacher, learning early on that nothing in life comes easy, but with a bit of elbow grease and a lot of heart, you can usually make things work. I landed a decent job at a local engineering firm, nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills and offered a clear path forward. I had my routine: early mornings, a quick workout, a packed lunch, and then the daily grind of schematics and blueprints. Evenings were for my small apartment in Corktown, a bit of reading, maybe a Red Wings game, and more often than not, a call or visit from the woman who, for the past 4 years, I believed was my future. Her name was Chloe. Chloe was a force of nature, or at least that's how she presented herself. She worked at Louis Vuitton, the fancy store downtown, surrounded by all the glitz and glamour that seemed so far removed from my world of gears and steel. She was beautiful, no doubt about it. Long, dark hair, eyes that sparkled when she laughed, and a style that always made heads turn. When we first met, it was at a dive bar of all places, a contrast that I found charming. She seemed different then, grounded despite her love for nice things. She said she admired my honesty, my no-nonsense approach to life. I was smitten. I saw a future with her, a house, maybe a couple of kids running around. I even started saving up for a ring, the kind of classic solitaire I knew she'd love, even if it wasn't a designer brand. Our relationship, at least from my perspective, was built on trust and shared dreams. We'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. She'd tell me about her day at the store, the demanding customers, the ridiculously priced handbags. I'd tell her about a difficult project at work, the satisfaction of solving a complex problem. We were a team, or so I thought. We had our disagreements, sure, every couple does. Sometimes it was about money, her desire for the finer things clashing with my more practical approach. Sometimes it was about her friends, a rather large circle of male acquaintances who seemed to always be around. I trusted her, though. She assured me they were just friends, colleagues, nothing more. And I, like an idiot, believed her. Looking back, I can pinpoint the little cracks that started appearing, the tiny fissures I rationalized away as normal relationship bumps. She started spending more time at work, or so she said. Late nights became more frequent, always a new inventory check, a special client, a fashion event. Her phone became an extension of her hand, always face down, always muted. When I'd ask to see something, a funny meme or a message she'd laughed at, she'd quickly swipe it away, a nervous smile on her face. Nothing, just girl talk, she'd say, or work stuff, you wouldn't get it. I wanted to believe her. I loved her, and love, as they say, makes you blind. Then came the trips. Weekend getaways with her girlfriends that always felt a little too vague, a little too spontaneous. She'd come back distant, sometimes agitated, sometimes overly affectionate, as if trying to overcompensate. I tried to talk to her to express my unease. I'd say, "Chloe, everything okay? You seem a little off." She'd brush it off, say I was being paranoid, that I didn't trust her. And that always hit me hard because trust was everything to me. So I'd back down, apologize, and try to be the supportive boyfriend she said I wasn't being. The final straw came not with a bang, but with a whisper. A quiet, anonymous email to my work address. The subject line simply read, "About Chloe." My heart pounded as I opened it. It was short, to the point, and utterly devastating. It detailed meetups, expensive dinners, lavish gifts, and a name, Marco, an Italian guy she'd met at Louis Vuitton. The email claimed it had been going on for a year. A whole year. My world, my carefully constructed future, shattered into a million pieces. I confronted her that night. I remember the cold dread in my stomach, the way my hands trembled as I held my phone, displaying the email. She denied it, of course, her eyes wide with what looked like genuine shock. She swore it was a lie, a jealous ex-colleague trying to stir up trouble. But I pushed. I demanded answers. And slowly, agonizingly, the truth started to trickle out, a twisted, ugly stream of deceit. First, she admitted to knowing him, but only for 2 months, a brief fling, a moment of weakness. She begged, she cried, she swore it was over, that she loved me, only me. I was reeling, trying to process 2 months of betrayal. It was awful, but maybe, just maybe, we could fix this. I was desperate for a lifeline, any lifeline. But the anonymous email had been right about one thing. Chloe was a master of lies. My gut, finally free from the blindfold of love, started screaming at me. I began piecing together snippets of conversations, inconsistencies, her frantic phone habits, the expensive new accessories that didn't quite fit into her Louis Vuitton employee discount story. A friend of mine, a guy who worked in tech, offered to help. He managed to recover some deleted messages, some call logs. It wasn't pretty. Not 2 months. A full year. Dinners, weekends away, gifts I never saw. And Marco, not just some guy. He was rich, with a capital R, the kind of rich that could buy out a Louis Vuitton store without blinking. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Not only had she cheated, but she had systematically lied to my face for an entire year. Every shared laugh, every intimate moment, every future plan we discussed, it was all tainted, a grotesque performance for her convenience. The anonymous sender had also mentioned her traits: materialistic, a compulsive liar, too many male friends, judgmental. At the time, I dismissed it as bitter rambling. Now, looking at the wreckage of my life, I saw it with horrifying clarity. Every single one of those traits, the red flags I'd ignored, the warning signs I'd explained away, suddenly made perfect sense. Chloe wasn't the woman I thought I loved. She was a stranger, a meticulously crafted illusion. The pain was unbearable, but beneath it, a cold, hard ember began to glow. An ember of something dangerous, something that demanded to be acknowledged. It was the birth of an idea, a dark, unsettling whisper of revenge. The revelation hit me like a Mack truck on the Lodge freeway. A full year of lies. A full year where I had been living a fantasy, while Chloe was building a different reality with someone else. The anonymous email, which at first had felt like a cruel joke, now felt like a desperate plea, a warning I had been too blind to heed. Marco, the rich Italian guy from Louis Vuitton, wasn't just a fleeting mistake. He was a deliberate choice, an upgrade in her materialistic game. My world didn't just shatter, it imploded, sucking all the air and light out of my existence. I walked around in a daze, the blueprints at work blurring into meaningless lines. My hands, usually steady, trembled as I tried to draw. Food tasted like ash. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford, haunted by images of Chloe laughing not with me but with him, her eyes sparkling with a joy I thought was reserved for us. The pain was a constant companion, a heavy weight in my chest. But beneath it, that cold ember, that whisper of revenge, began to flicker brighter. It wasn't just about anger anymore. It was about the profound injustice, the feeling of being made a fool. Ryan Kelly, a man who prided himself on his honesty and straightforwardness, had been played for a complete sucker. And Chloe, with her designer bags and her practiced smiles, had gotten away with it, seemingly untouched. My first thought was to expose her, to rip away her carefully constructed facade. I imagined marching into Louis Vuitton, phone in hand, showing her colleagues the recovered messages, screaming the truth for everyone to hear. But the thought quickly died. What good would it do? It would be a messy spectacle, and in the end, I'd be the one looking unhinged, while Chloe would likely play the victim, her tears as fake as her affections. Detroiters were tough, but they also valued dignity, even in their anger. Making a scene wasn't my style. Instead, I tried a more subtle approach, a test really, to see if she had any shame left. I messaged one of her male friends, a guy named Mike I'd always found a bit too chummy with her. I casually mentioned that Chloe and I had broken up, leaving out the messy details. I figured word would get back to her, and maybe, just maybe, she'd feel a pang of guilt, a flicker of remorse. But nothing. Days passed, and I heard nothing from Chloe. Her silence was a louder condemnation than any angry text could have been. It meant she either didn't care enough for my breakup to even register, or she was too busy with Marco to notice. The betrayal festered, turning my grief into a quiet, simmering rage. I started watching her, not in a creepy, stalking way, but in a desperate attempt to understand how I could have been so wrong. I'd drive by Louis Vuitton after work just to see her car, to catch a glimpse of her leaving. Sometimes, Marco's sleek black Mercedes would be waiting. I'd see her get in, laughing, leaning into him, and a fresh wave of nausea would wash over me. He was older, maybe in his late 40s, always impeccably dressed, with that smug, confident air of a man who knew he could get whatever he wanted. And he had wanted Chloe. I became obsessed with Marco. Who was he? What did he do? I dug through social media, online articles, anything I could find. Turns out, Marco Rossi was a big shot in the automotive supply chain industry, a man who had built an empire from scratch. He owned several factories, not just here in Michigan, but across the Midwest. He was a pillar of the community, a philanthropist, a man with a spotless public image, the kind of man who would never be caught dead in a dive bar. He was everything Chloe had ever openly admired in a man, everything I was. This realization only deepened my sense of inadequacy. It wasn't just that she cheated, it was that she cheated with someone who represented everything she secretly coveted. My hard work, my honest living, my plans for a simple, good life, none of it could compete with Marco's wealth and status. I felt like a small-town kid trying to play in the big leagues. My revenge started to shift from an emotional outburst to a cold, calculated plan. I couldn't hurt Chloe directly without hurting myself more. But Marco was different. He had been a willing participant, a man who knew Chloe was with me, yet pursued her anyway. He was the symbol of her betrayal, the embodiment of everything she desired. And he was powerful. Taking him down even a little would be a message, not just to Chloe, but to myself. It would be about reclaiming a piece of my dignity. I started spending my evenings differently. Instead of Red Wings games, I was poring over public records, news articles, and business journals related to Marco Rossi's companies. I wanted to find a crack in his perfect facade, a weakness I could exploit. It was like a complex engineering problem, one that required patience, precision, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. My background in engineering, my ability to break down complex systems and find their vulnerabilities, finally felt useful for something beyond schematics. I found minor violations, small fines, and the usual bureaucratic hiccups that most large companies encountered. Nothing that would bring down an empire. But then I stumbled upon a small article, buried deep in an obscure local business paper, about a land dispute from 5 years ago. Marco's company had acquired a plot of land for a new factory, and there had been some controversy about the environmental impact, specifically regarding a small, protected wetland adjacent to the property. The article mentioned a local environmental group that had vigorously opposed the project, but eventually, their efforts had been steamrolled by Marco's legal team and political influence. It was a tiny thread, barely visible, but it sparked something in me. I remembered my dad, a passionate outdoorsman, always talking about protecting Michigan's natural beauty. He'd instilled in me a deep respect for the environment. Marco, with his blatant disregard for it, felt like a direct insult to everything I valued. This wasn't just about Chloe anymore. It was about something bigger, something that felt morally right. I started researching the wetland, the environmental regulations, the permits Marco's company had obtained. The further I delved, the more I realized how vast and impenetrable his empire seemed. He had lawyers, lobbyists, and connections that stretched deep into the city's power structure. I was just Ryan Kelly, an engineer from Detroit, with a broken heart and a burning desire for justice. The odds were stacked against me, monumentally. My initial attempts to gather more information hit dead ends. Calls to the environmental group mentioned in the article went unreturned. Government agencies were polite but unhelpful, citing privacy concerns or bureaucratic red tape. It felt like trying to chip away at a mountain with a spoon. I was getting nowhere, and the frustration was a bitter taste in my mouth. Chloe, meanwhile, seemed to be thriving. I'd see pictures of her on social media, tagged by her friends. Lavish dinners, trips to exotic places, new designer accessories that screamed Marco's wealth. She looked happier than she had ever been with me, her eyes sparkling with genuine joy. It was a stark contrast to my own life, which felt like it was spiraling into a dark, obsessive void. I was neglecting my job, my friends were starting to notice my withdrawn behavior, and my apartment felt less like a home and more like a war room, cluttered with maps, documents, and scribbled notes. I was losing weight, my face was gaunt, and the once clear path forward I had envisioned for my life was now obscured by a fog of anger and despair. This wasn't working. My initial, impulsive ideas for revenge were either too weak, too public, or too easily brushed aside. I was hitting walls everywhere I turned. I was running myself ragged, draining my emotional and physical reserves, and for what? To see Chloe happy and Marco living his life untouched. I was becoming the pathetic, bitter ex-boyfriend, exactly what I swore I wouldn't be. I hit rock bottom one cold Detroit night. I was sitting in my car, parked down the street from Marco's sprawling mansion in Bloomfield Hills, watching the lights glow warmly within. Chloe's car was in the driveway. It was clear she was staying there more often now. I imagined them inside, enjoying a life of luxury and deceit, while I sat alone in the dark, consumed by my hatred. A wave of crushing defeat washed over me. What was I doing? This obsession was destroying me, not them. I was turning into someone I didn't recognize, someone small and vindictive. For a moment I considered giving up, letting it all go. But then I saw her through a window, laughing, raising a glass with Marco. And the cold ember which had flickered so weakly roared back to life. No, I wouldn't give up. I wouldn't let them win. This wasn't just about personal revenge anymore. It was about principle. It was about fighting for what was right, for the values I believed in, values that they in their arrogance and greed had trampled underfoot. But I needed a new strategy. My attempts at grand gestures or petty slights were useless. I needed something precise, something surgical. I needed to hit Marco where it truly hurt him, not just his pride but his carefully constructed empire. And I needed to do it in a way that he wouldn't even see coming, a way that would leave him wondering how a regular guy like Ryan Kelly from Detroit could have ever pulled it off. The whisper of revenge was no longer just a whisper. It was a quiet, determined resolve, hardening into a plan far more intricate and far more dangerous than anything I had initially conceived. The quiet, determined resolve that settled over me that cold Detroit night was different from the frantic, desperate anger I'd felt before. It wasn't a scream. It was a hum, deep and constant, like a powerful engine warming up. I wasn't going to smash Marco's empire with a sledgehammer. I was going to dismantle it, bolt by meticulously planned bolt, like a master mechanic taking apart a faulty machine. My engineering background, which Chloe had often dismissed as boring, was about to become my greatest weapon. I started with the wetland, that forgotten article about a land dispute from years ago. It had stuck with me because it felt like a betrayal of the land itself, a disregard for the natural world that my dad had taught me to cherish. Marco's company, Rossi Automotive, had built a new factory right next to a protected area. My initial research had been broad and unfocused, hitting dead ends. This time I went granular. I dug into environmental impact assessments, zoning laws, water quality reports, and federal and state wetland protection acts. It was dense, dry reading, but I found myself energized by it, fueled by a purpose beyond just my own heartbreak. I learned about the Clean Water Act, the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy EGLE for short, and something called Section 404 permits. These permits were required for any activities that involved discharging dredged or fill material into wetlands. Marco's company had gotten their permits, of course, but the permits came with conditions. Strict conditions. Things like monitoring runoff, maintaining certain buffer zones, and mitigating any unavoidable impacts by restoring or creating new wetlands elsewhere. This last part, mitigation, was a common loophole, a way for developers to pave over nature and then claim they made up for it somewhere else. I had a hunch this was where Marco would be vulnerable. The more I read, the clearer it became. Building a factory, especially one tied to the automotive supply chain with its heavy machinery and potential for chemical runoff, next to a protected wetland, was like building a house of cards next to a hurricane. It required an almost impossibly perfect adherence to environmental regulations to avoid long-term damage. And perfect adherence wasn't usually Marco Rossi's style, not if it cost him time or money. His public image might have been spotless, but I doubted his operational practices were. I realized I couldn't just look for a single, obvious violation. Marco's lawyers would have covered that years ago. I needed to find a pattern of neglect, a slow, creeping disregard for the conditions of his permits that, over time, would amount to a significant environmental impact. It was like looking for rust on a steel beam. You wouldn't see it immediately, but given enough time and exposure, it would compromise the entire structure. My evenings and weekends transformed into a self-taught crash course in environmental law and industrial ecology. My apartment became even more of a war room, papers and maps spread across every surface. I even bought a second monitor for my computer, so I could cross-reference documents and satellite images. I found old aerial photographs of the area before and after the factory was built. The wetland looked different. Subtle changes, but noticeable if you knew what to look for. Altered water flow patterns, changes in vegetation, even a slight discoloration in some of the smaller ponds. These were tiny pieces of a much larger puzzle, but these were just observations. I needed proof. Hard, undeniable proof that Marco Rossi's company was failing to uphold their environmental responsibilities. And to get that, I needed to get closer to the source, to the actual data. Environmental monitoring reports, compliance audits, water sample results, these were the documents I needed to see. I remembered my earlier failed attempt to contact the local environmental group. This time, I approached it differently. Instead of a vague inquiry, I sent a detailed email outlining my concerns, referencing specific permit numbers and environmental statutes. I highlighted the potential long-term damage and framed it not as a personal vendetta, but as a public interest issue. I even included some of the satellite image comparisons I'd found. I made myself sound like a concerned citizen, an amateur environmentalist, rather than a vengeful ex-boyfriend. A week later, I got a response. It was from a woman named Sarah Chen, a senior researcher at the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy, an organization that, among other things, actively monitored industrial impact on local ecosystems. Her email was cautious but intrigued. She thanked me for my diligence and asked if I could meet her for coffee. My heart pounded with a mix of fear and exhilaration. This was it. This was my first real step into the deeper currents of Marco's world. Meeting Sarah meant exposing my research, my suspicions, and potentially myself. But it also meant gaining an ally, someone with the expertise and resources to help me navigate this complex terrain. When I met Sarah, she was exactly what I expected: sharp, analytical, and radiating a quiet intensity. She had a no-nonsense demeanor, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her eyes missing nothing. I laid out my findings, showing her the documents, the aerial photos, explaining my process. I tried to keep Chloe and Marco's personal betrayal out of it, focusing solely on the environmental concerns. But as I spoke, I realized how intertwined it all was for me. How Marco's disregard for the environment mirrored his disregard for my relationship, for trust, for basic human decency. Sarah listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking a precise question. When I finished, she was silent for a moment, tapping her pen against her notepad. "You've done an impressive amount of homework, Ryan," she said, her voice measured. "These are concerning. Rossi Automotive has a clean public record, but what you're suggesting here could point to systemic noncompliance, the kind that slowly chokes an ecosystem." She explained that large corporations often relied on the sheer volume of paperwork and the understaffing of regulatory agencies to hide minor, ongoing violations. Each individual violation might seem insignificant, but cumulatively they could be devastating. "It's a game of attrition," she said. "They bet on the fact that no one will dig deep enough or care enough to connect all the dots." "I care," I told her, my voice firm. "And I'm digging." Sarah smiled, a genuine if slightly weary smile. "I believe you. This isn't a quick fix, Ryan. It could take months, even years, to build a case that would stand up. And Rossi has a formidable legal team. They'll bury you in paperwork and drag you through every legal loophole imaginable. They might even try to discredit you." Her words were a cold splash of reality, but they didn't deter me. They strengthened my resolve. This wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon. "I'm ready," I said. What's the next step? She suggested filing a Freedom of Information Act FOIA request with EGLE for all environmental monitoring reports, inspection records, and compliance audits related to Rossi Automotive's factory near the wetland, specifically for the last 5 years. It'll be a mountain of documents, she warned, and they'll probably try to redact half of it, but it's where we start. The FOIA request was a bureaucratic nightmare. I spent hours filling out forms, citing specific statutes, and learning the precise language required to ensure they couldn't easily dismiss it. It felt like I was battling an invisible enemy, an endless network of red tape and legal jargon. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into a month, with no response. The silence was maddening. It reinforced Sarah's warning. Marco's empire was designed to be impenetrable. Meanwhile, Chloe and Marco's life seemed to be ascending to new heights of opulent bliss. Social media, a cruel window into their perfect world, showed them on a yacht in the Caribbean, then at a gala event in New York, then posing in front of a new, ridiculously expensive sports car. Chloe glowed, her face alight with a happiness I had once believed was mine to provide. The contrast to my own life, spent hunched over spreadsheets and legal documents, was stark and demoralizing. My apartment, once my sanctuary, now felt like a lonely bunker. My friends, noticing my increasingly gaunt appearance and obsessive focus, tried to intervene. "Ryan, you need to let this go," my buddy Mark said one night after I'd canceled dinner plans for the 3rd time that month. "She's not worth it. You're destroying yourself." I knew he was right in a way. I was a shadow of my former self. My engineering job, once a source of quiet satisfaction, now felt like a distraction from my true purpose. I was perpetually tired, but sleep offered no escape from the relentless churning of my mind. The bitterness was a physical ache, a constant companion, but I couldn't let it go. Not now. Not when I felt I was so close to uncovering something real, something that transcended my personal pain. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the documents started arriving. Not all at once, but in frustratingly small, heavily redacted batches. Thousands of pages of technical data, environmental reports, and internal memos. It was a digital haystack, and I was looking for a very specific needle. I spent every waking moment outside of work sifting through them. Sarah helped, dedicating some of her own time to guide me through the complexities, pointing out what to look for, what specific data points might indicate a problem. She showed me how to read the chemical analysis reports, how to interpret the water flow measurements, how to identify inconsistencies in the mitigation efforts. My engineering mind, trained to spot flaws in complex systems, devoured the information. And slowly, painstakingly, the picture began to emerge. Not a single, dramatic violation, but a pattern of subtle, ongoing noncompliance. Consistently elevated levels of certain pollutants in the runoff, just below the threshold that would trigger an immediate red flag. Mitigation wetlands that weren't thriving but slowly dying due to improper maintenance and insufficient hydrological connection to the main wetland. Buffer zones that were encroached upon, little by little over the years. It was death by 1,000 cuts, slowly suffocating the protected ecosystem. The most damning evidence came from a series of internal memos, heavily redacted, but enough remained to piece together a disturbing narrative. There were discussions about cost-saving measures related to environmental controls, optimizing reporting procedures, and even a veiled reference to managing inspections. It wasn't outright illegal, not on the surface, but it hinted at a deliberate strategy to minimize compliance costs, even at the expense of the environment. Marco wasn't just wealthy. He was meticulously careful about how he maintained that wealth, even if it meant cutting corners where he thought no one would look. This wasn't just about a one-time affair anymore. This was about a powerful man using his influence and resources to systematically undermine environmental protections for profit, all while maintaining a pristine public image. This was about a deep-seated corruption, a rot that went far beyond personal betrayal. And I, Ryan Kelly, the ordinary guy from Detroit, had stumbled upon it. The stakes felt enormous now. This wasn't just about me and Chloe and Marco. It was about the integrity of the system, about corporate accountability, about protecting the land I loved. I felt a surge of cold fury, mixed with an almost terrifying sense of purpose. I had found the crack. Now I just needed to figure out how to drive a wedge into it and split Marco's carefully constructed empire wide open. But the thought that kept me up at night was this: if Marco Rossi could hide this for so long, what other secrets was he capable of burying? And what would he do to protect them once I started digging them up? The next phase of my revenge wouldn't just be intricate, it would be dangerous. I was about to step into the lion's den. I was about to step into the lion's den, and the air around me felt thick with an impending storm. Sarah Chen, with her sharp mind and unwavering commitment, became my anchor in this treacherous new world. After reviewing the mountain of redacted documents, we knew we had enough to raise serious questions, but not enough for a definitive, irrefutable slam-dunk case against Marco Rossi. Not yet. They've been clever, Ryan, Sarah explained, poring over a stack of water quality reports one evening in her office, which was a chaotic but organized haven of environmental data. Each individual exceedance is just under the reporting threshold. Each mitigation effort just barely meets the minimum requirement, and every internal memo is vague enough to offer plausible deniability. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts for the environment, and it's almost impossible to prove malicious intent when you have a battalion of corporate lawyers framing every action as cost-efficient or industry standard. My engineering brain understood. It was like a bridge designed to just barely meet stress tolerances, shaving off material here and there to save money, technically sound on paper but ultimately weaker and more prone to failure. Marco wasn't building a faulty bridge, he was building a faulty ecosystem. So what's the next step? I asked, my voice tight with a mixture of frustration and a renewed sense of purpose. We can't just let them get away with slowly poisoning that wetland. Sarah leaned back, her gaze distant for a moment. We need to shift tactics. They've locked down the paperwork. We need physical evidence. We need to go into that wetland, conduct our own independent sampling, and get undeniable proof that their mitigation efforts are a sham and that their runoff is indeed impacting the ecosystem. The idea thrilled me and terrified me in equal measure. This was no longer just about digging through old documents from the safety of my apartment. This was about boots on the ground, venturing into the very place Marco Rossi's company was supposedly protecting. How do we do that without getting caught? I asked. They must have security, and it's private property technically. Sarah nodded, a grim line forming on her lips. It's tricky. We'd need to access the wetland from public land or get permission. But given Rossi's track record, permission is unlikely. We'd be operating in a gray area, Ryan. If we're caught, it could mean trespassing charges, legal trouble, and they'd use it to discredit all our findings. I'm willing to take that risk, I said, the words coming out stronger than I expected. The thought of Chloe and Marco living their lavish life while I sat by and let them destroy a piece of Michigan's natural heritage was unbearable. This had become bigger than my broken heart. It was about standing up for something real. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and I meticulously planned our excursions. She connected me with a network of experienced environmental volunteers, a dedicated group of older folks, mostly retired scientists and naturalists, who quietly worked to monitor and protect Michigan's waterways. They were seasoned, resourceful, and knew how to be discreet. Our first few trips were reconnaissance missions. Under the cover of early morning fog or twilight, we navigated the edges of the wetland, using public access points, carefully observing the factory's perimeter. I learned to identify different species of plants and birds, to read the subtle signs of a healthy ecosystem versus one under stress. My engineering eye for detail proved invaluable, as I noticed things others might miss. A faint, unusual sheen on the water surface near a drainage pipe, a lack of insect life in certain areas, the stunted growth of native plants where they should have been flourishing. We took photographs, high-resolution shots using a good camera I borrowed from my dad, documenting everything. We used GPS to mark sampling points and meticulously recorded our observations. It was slow, painstaking work, often cold and muddy, but with every piece of evidence we gathered, my resolve hardened. Then came the sampling. Sarah provided me with basic water testing kits and taught me how to properly collect samples for laboratory analysis. We focused on collecting samples from the factory's outflow pipes and comparing them to samples taken upstream and from healthy parts of the wetland. It was like forensic engineering, but for nature. One chilly autumn evening, as I was collecting a water sample near a culvert pipe partially obscured by overgrown reeds, a blinding spotlight suddenly hit me. My heart leaped into my throat. A gruff voice boomed, "Freeze, private property, what are you doing here?" Two burly security guards, illuminated by the harsh light, emerged from the shadows. They looked less like typical security and more like ex-military, their faces stern and unyielding. My mind raced. This was it. The lion's den had finally snapped shut. I swallowed hard, my hand still clutching the sampling kit. I'm just taking some pictures of the wildlife," I stammered, trying to sound as innocent as possible, though I knew it was a pathetic lie. One of the guards, a man with a scarred eyebrow, stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Taking pictures? At this hour? On Rossi Automotive property? We've had reports of suspicious activity around here." He gestured to the camera bag slung over my shoulder. "Looks like you're doing more than just taking pictures, pal." They confiscated my camera, my sampling kit, and my phone. They didn't call the police, which struck me as odd, but they made it very clear that if I ever returned, I'd be arrested for trespassing and face the full force of Marco Rossi's legal team. They gave me a thinly veiled threat about leaving well enough alone, and sent me packing with a chilling warning to forget everything I thought I knew. I called Sarah immediately, using a borrowed phone. She was furious but also concerned. "This changes things, Ryan. They know someone's sniffing around. Marco Rossi doesn't mess around. This is a clear intimidation tactic." The incident, instead of scaring me off, only fueled my fire. Their reaction confirmed my suspicions. They had something to hide. Why else wouldn't they just call the police and let the law handle a simple trespasser? No, they wanted to keep it quiet, away from official channels. That meant the evidence I was collecting was hitting a nerve. The confiscated camera and samples were a setback, but I had already backed up most of my photos and shared preliminary notes with Sarah. And those guards didn't know about the deeper, more sophisticated water tests we had initiated with the help of Sarah's contacts at a university lab. Those results were still pending. Marco's retaliation wasn't limited to veiled threats in a dark wetland. A few days later, my supervisor at the engineering firm called me into his office. He looked uncomfortable, avoiding my gaze. "Ryan, we've received some concerning feedback," he began, shuffling papers on his desk. "Anonymous complaints about your focus, your dedication. It seems you've been distracted lately." I knew instantly what this was. Marco. He was using his influence, trying to hit me where it hurt. He was a big name in Detroit business, and a whisper from him could carry a lot of weight. "Distracted by what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "Well, there were also some vague allegations about unprofessional conduct and conflict of interest related to a local business entity," he said, still not meeting my eyes. "It's all very unofficial, of course, but given the circumstances and your recent changes in behavior, we've decided to put you on administrative leave for a few weeks. Paid, of course, while we investigate. Just a precaution." Administrative leave. It was a thinly veiled warning, a way to sideline me without outright firing me, at least not yet. It bought them time, and it put me in a precarious position. I was losing my job, or at least my access to it, all because I dared to challenge Marco Rossi. My friends rallied around me, expressing concern but also a growing sense of helplessness. "Ryan, this is too much," Mark pleaded. "He's got too much power. You're going to lose everything." Chloe, meanwhile, continued to flaunt her new life. I saw a picture of her receiving a diamond necklace from Marco at some charity gala, her smile dazzling, utterly oblivious or perhaps uncaring of the wreckage she had left behind. The bitterness welled up inside me, a hot, painful surge. She hadn't just moved on. She was actively thriving in the gilded cage Marco had built for her, a cage built on lies and environmental degradation. But instead of breaking me, these setbacks forged a new layer of steel in my resolve. This wasn't just about the wetland anymore, or even about justice for the environment. It was about fighting back against a bully who thought he could use his money and power to crush anyone who stood in his way. It was about proving that an ordinary guy from Detroit, with nothing but a broken heart and a belief in what was right, could stand up to an empire. Sarah, seeing my determination, doubled down her efforts. "They're trying to silence you, Ryan," she said, her eyes blazing with a similar fire. "That means we're on the right track. We just need to be smarter." She put me in touch with a pro bono environmental lawyer, a fierce woman named Evelyn Reed who had a reputation for taking on tough corporate cases. Evelyn listened to my story, reviewed the documents Sarah and I had compiled, and saw the pattern. "This is classic corporate bullying," Evelyn stated, her voice sharp and authoritative. "They're trying to bankrupt you with legal fees or scare you into submission, but we have a few arrows in our quiver. Firstly, your administrative leave. If they fire you without just cause, that's a wrongful termination suit. Secondly, the harassment. We can file a complaint with the appropriate authorities, but most importantly, we have the environmental data. If those lab results come back confirming your suspicions, Marco Rossi is going to have a much bigger problem on his hands than a disgruntled former employee." The university lab results finally came in. Sarah called me, her voice hushed with a mixture of excitement and gravity. "Ryan," she said, "you were right, more than right. The water samples show significantly elevated levels of heavy metals and other industrial pollutants, far beyond what's permissible and directly traceable to the factory's unique industrial processes. And the samples from the mitigation wetland. They confirm what we suspected. It's failing. Completely. The plants are dying, the soil composition is off, and it's not performing its function. It's a greenwashed facade." A cold, hard thrill shot through me. This was it. This was the undeniable proof, the smoking gun. Not just subtle noncompliance, but clear, quantifiable environmental damage and a failed mitigation effort that exposed Marco's company for what it truly was, a polluter hiding behind a public relations front. "What does this mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "It means," Sarah replied, her voice gaining strength, "that Marco Rossi isn't just facing fines. He's facing a potential lawsuit from the state, federal penalties, and a massive public relations disaster. This kind of environmental damage, particularly to a protected wetland, can trigger severe regulatory action. It could cost him millions, ruin his reputation, and depending on how deliberate the noncompliance was, there could even be criminal investigations." The words hung in the air, heavy with consequence. Millions. Criminal investigations. It was far more than I had ever dared to dream. My revenge, once a personal, painful wound, had transformed into a weapon for justice, a righteous hammer against a man who believed himself untouchable. But the fight wasn't over. Getting the evidence was one thing, making sure it saw the light of day, and that it actually led to Marco's downfall was another entirely. He wouldn't go down without a fight. He would use every ounce of his power, every lawyer, every connection to bury this. I was no longer just Ryan Kelly, the heartbroken engineer. I was a man with a mission, armed with truth and supported by a team of dedicated people. I had stepped into the lion's den and I had emerged, not unscathed, but with the very thing I needed to bring the lion down. The final act was about to begin, and this time Chloe, basking in her ill-gotten luxury, would be caught in the fallout. She would see, finally, the true cost of her choices and the kind of man she had discarded. The final act, as Sarah had called it, was set in motion not with a bang, but with a carefully orchestrated legal maneuver. Evelyn Reed, my fierce pro bono lawyer, and Sarah Chen, with her meticulous environmental data, filed a formal complaint with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, along with the damning lab results and the extensive photographic evidence. They also reached out to a prominent investigative journalist known for exposing corporate malfeasance, a woman who understood the power of a well-told story backed by irrefutable facts. The initial silence from EGLE was deafening, a testament to Marco Rossi's influence. But Evelyn and Sarah knew how to play the game. They leaked snippets of the story to the journalist, just enough to pique her interest and confirm the severity of the allegations. The journalist, armed with Evelyn's legal prowess and Sarah's scientific backing, started making calls, asking pointed questions, and demanding answers. It began subtly. A small article in a regional business paper, then a local news segment hinting at an impending environmental scandal. Marco Rossi, who had always meticulously curated his public image, suddenly found himself under an unwelcome spotlight. He tried to dismiss it as a smear campaign, ordering his legal team to send cease and desist letters. But the truth, once unleashed, was impossible to contain. The dam finally broke when the journalist published her in-depth exposé. It was a brutal, meticulously researched piece that laid bare Rossi Automotive's systematic environmental noncompliance, their failed mitigation efforts, and the tangible harm inflicted upon the protected wetland. She included direct quotes from Sarah, detailed explanations of my engineering analysis, and anonymous sources from within EGLE who corroborated the story, now feeling emboldened by the public attention. The public outcry was immediate and fierce. Environmental groups, community activists, and even some of Marco's own employees who had long suspected foul play came forward. EGLE, no longer able to ignore the mounting pressure, launched a full-scale investigation, issuing citations and demanding immediate remediation. The state attorney general's office announced they were exploring potential criminal charges for deliberate environmental negligence. Marco Rossi's empire, once seemingly invincible, began to crumble. Contracts were suspended, investors pulled out, and his carefully constructed public image shattered. His philanthropy, once seen as generosity, was now viewed as a cynical attempt to greenwash his illegal activities. He was forced to release public statements, but his denials rang hollow against the overwhelming evidence. And Chloe, she was caught in the crossfire. I saw the news reports, the unflattering paparazzi photos of her and Marco looking distraught, leaving their mansion. The lavish life she had so eagerly embraced was now tainted, exposed as built on a foundation of deceit and environmental destruction. Louis Vuitton, sensitive to its brand image, quietly let her go, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Her once dazzling smile was replaced by a haunted, anxious expression. The designer bags and exotic trips no longer seemed glamorous. They were symbols of her complicity, her willful ignorance. One evening, my phone rang. It was Chloe. I almost didn't answer. Her voice was thin, shaky. "Ryan," she whispered, a desperate plea in her tone. "What have you done?" I took a deep breath, the cold ember in my chest finally turning into a steady, clean flame. "I exposed the truth, Chloe," I said, my voice calm, devoid of anger but firm. "Something you were too busy enjoying to even notice." She started to cry, rambling about how Marco had misled her, how she had no idea. But I knew better. I had seen her embrace the luxury, ignore the red flags, choose comfort over integrity. "You always said I was boring, Chloe," I continued, my gaze fixed on the Detroit skyline outside my window, "that I didn't understand your world. Well, now you're seeing the true cost of that world, and I'm finally living in one that's real." I hung up, feeling no satisfaction from her tears, only a quiet sense of finality. My revenge wasn't about destroying her, but about reclaiming myself. Weeks turned into months. Marco Rossi faced monumental fines, criminal charges, and the slow, agonizing dismantling of his empire. The wetland, thanks to the efforts of Sarah and countless volunteers, began its long, slow healing process. As for me, I eventually got my job back, with a renewed sense of purpose. I continued to work with Sarah and Evelyn, lending my engineering skills to other environmental causes. My apartment was still modest, but it was a home filled with genuine purpose, not empty dreams. The pain of Chloe's betrayal would always be a part of my story, but it no longer defined me. I had faced the darkness, navigated the complexities, and emerged not as a bitter victim, but as a man who had chosen to stand for what was right. Detroit had taught me resilience, and now I understood what it truly meant to rebuild not just a city but a life, brick by honest brick, leaving behind only the poetic justice of truth revealed. The lion was brought down, not by a roar of anger but by the quiet, meticulous work of an ordinary man from Detroit. And that in itself was a victory far sweeter than any quick, vengeful strike. My world, once shattered, was finally piecing itself back together, stronger and truer than before.